Good morning, everyone. I'm sitting. Good morning to today's program. Welcome to the Woodrow Wilson Center and welcome to the Canada Institute to today's program on Buy American, Creating or Costing U.S. Jobs. First, a little word about the Wilson Center, since we are being webcast and some of you may not know us. The Wilson Center was founded by the Congress in 1968 as a living memorial to the 28th president. Other presidents got blocks of marble, granite, and since Wilson was our only president with a PhD, having been president of Princeton and governor of New Jersey, and always felt the need that scholars and policymakers ought to speak with each other, it was decided that Woodrow Wilson would have a living memorial where we would work on dialogue, and that's essentially what we do. We don't have any legislative agendas. We don't promote policy. We get people together to talk about the important issues of the day. The Canada Institute is about one of 22 programs here at the center, and we try to get government people, NGOs, industry, others to talk together. At the same time, we have about 50 scholars at any one time who come and think big thoughts. Some are here for extended 9-month positions and others here for shorter periods of time, but it's a really lively, engaging place where the intellectual world meets the policy world. The Canada Institute works to increase awareness and knowledge about Canada and Canada-U.S. issues among policymakers and opinion leaders. Those of you who've been around probably know that Canada is not much discussed in Washington, even though it is our largest trading partner, and our economies are almost inextricably linked, and we need to know more about each other. We were founded in 2001 and essentially work on 3 areas: energy, environment, trade, and border security issues. We have an upcoming program on December 16th on changing climates in North American politics, which sort of looks at regional aspects of climate change issues in North America. If you'd like to be on our mailing list, we have a very short, every 2-week email that comes out listing what's happened, what's coming up. Please leave your card or sign up in the back. We'll be happy to let you know briefly what's going on, but we won't inundate you with things. Today's topic may not be one that we see regularly in the news today, a lot of us, but it's certainly one that's top of mind for many American companies that source from abroad. It's also one of the major trade issues between the United States and Canada. I was at the State Department yesterday, and there was a remark that in the 11 times that Prime Minister Harper has met with President Obama, Harper has raised the issue of Buy America 11 times. To be more specific and probably more succinct than this explanation deserves, Buy American, and the topic of our program today, refers to the exclusion by the Congress of non-American suppliers and manufacturers from bidding on government stimulus projects. It has hit Canada particularly hard. Since the Free Trade Agreement of the late 1980s and NAFTA in the early 1990s, our two economies, as I said, are in many ways inextricably linked. Pledges by President Obama to respect international treaties have made little material difference, since most of the federal stimulus dollars are being spent by state and municipal governments. Complicating things further is that Canadian provinces and municipalities have not signed on to WTO rules on government procurement, which the U.S. is basing its argument on. Canada's Trade Minister Stockwell Day has met several times with his U.S. counterpart, Ron Kirk, the USTR, to work things out, and things are essentially being worked out, but I don't see any solution imminent. Canada has been seeking an exclusion from U.S. rules, and some Canadian municipalities have even gone so far as their own tit-for-tat programs on by Canadian rules. Today we have 4 very knowledgeable people with us to discuss some of the complicated issues that are tied up in this Buy American issue. To my left, Baugh is Executive Director of the AFL-CIO Industrial Union Council, which is the coordinating body for the Federation's manufacturing policy and legislative initiatives. Baugh is the co-chair of the AFL-CIO Energy Task Force and has served as leader of the U.S. labor negotiations delegations to several United Nations Climate Change Conference negotiations. Bob has experience in union, community, and government activism. He served as a union organizer and economist educator for the International Woodworkers of America, Secretary-Treasurer for the Oregon AFL-CIO, Deputy Director of the Oregon Economic Development Department, and Deputy Director of the AFL-CIO Working for America Institute. To his left, Don Champney is President of the Water and Wastewater Equipment Manufacturers Association, a Washington, D.C. based national not-for-profit trade organization representing the interests of manufacturers serving the water supply and wastewater treatment industry. Dawn currently serves as a member of the Environmental Technologies Trade Advisory Committee, which advises 19 federal departments and agencies on policies and programs to expand U.S. exports of environmental goods and services. She also serves as a member of the Trade and Environment Policy Advisory Committee, providing guidance on environmental policy to the U.S. Office of the Trade Representative with respect to U.S. negotiating objectives and bargaining before entering into trade agreements. Chris Whatley, to Dawn's left, is the Washington Office Director for the Council of State Governments, which oversees federal advocacy and international outreach. Since the enactment of the Recovery Act, Chris has spearheaded a rapid response effort to provide analysis to state leaders on funding opportunities, deadlines, and reporting requirements in this historic legislation, including launching staterecovery.org, a comprehensive resource for identifying funding opportunities and tracking state responses for the Recovery Act. In Chris's former position as Director of International Programs, he was responsible for coordinating all of the Council's international activities, including efforts to promote multi-state cooperation in trade promotion and cross-border cooperation with Canada and Mexico. He led a successful advocacy campaign to exempt state economic development agencies from fee increases imposed by the U.S. Department of Commerce and worked closely with the White House Office of Intergovernmental Affairs and the United States Trade Representative to advance state interests in trade policy. And to his left, who will arrive, he's on his way, is Jeff Schott. Jeff is a senior fellow with the Peterson Institute for International Economics, working largely on international trade and policy and economic sanctions. Jeff has been a visiting lecturer at Princeton University, an adjunct professor at Georgetown, a senior associate at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and an official of the U.S. Treasury Department in international trade and energy policy. During the Tokyo round of multilateral trade negotiations, Jeff was a member of the U.S. delegation that negotiated the GATT Subsidies Code. Since January 2003, he's been a member of the Trade and Environmental Policy Advisory Committee of the U.S. government. He is also a member of the Advisory Committee on International Economic Policy of the U.S. Department of State. Today's program is going to be full, so I would ask that when latecomers come, and they will, to let them come fill in the sides and up front, and there may be some standing room in the back. As I said, we are being webcast live, so when we do ask questions, I would ask that you wait for the microphone to come by, and the webcast will be archived and posted shortly, along with, we hope to get most of the presentations and ancillary materials as well. So with that, let me turn it over to Bob.
Thank you, David. Okay. And for doing this, which buttons do I use?
Forward.
Okay, great. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here and a pleasure to take part to this discussion. I'm going to couch this in a couple of ways and put it in a context of the way that we have viewed it as the labor movement and its context with the overall American economy. First, let me stipulate, we believe this is creating jobs, very simply. And it comes down to a fundamental economic fact that if you recycle dollars in your own economy, you will create more direct and indirect employment. That's the bottom line, and that is part of the motivating factor behind our pushing the use of what has existed in law in the United States for more than 70 years, which are Buy America, and various variations of that theme. There's several other laws that are Buy America or the Berry Amendment or pieces of that, but get at the same point about the use of public monies and procurement through domestic means in that. This is really wrapped up, I think, in a much larger discussion, and this is the context that I want to put it in. First, we as a trade union movement moved on the environmental issue 4 years ago when we created our task force and came to two basic conclusions. One, there is a climate crisis in this world. The science is there, and we have to do something about it. And like every other country in the world, we've also taken the perspective, how do you do something about that crisis and create opportunity at the same time? And the bottom line in that is you've got to really think about how you invest in your own economy to lower your carbon footprint and create good jobs in the process. That's why you see the original title of this about green jobs, good jobs. And that is what we are attempting to do in the United States. We come into a situation where there's an economic reality. And I think this statement really covered what we thought. This is from our Executive Council statement of a year ago, said that our nation stands at this crossroads of opportunity for domestic investments in innovation, new technology, energy efficiency that will save jobs, create new jobs, new industries, and revitalize American manufacturing. I represent the Industrial Union Council of the AFL-CIO. We are the manufacturing unions of the United States. So we believe this is an opportunity in a time of crisis to do these things. That's the vision. The second sentence to this, that there is no guarantee that these will be good jobs or that the investments will be made here unless we fight to make it so, is the political reality in this country. And that is exactly what we are doing. What is the context we're in this struggle? Well, we've lost 5.5 million manufacturing jobs since the year 2000, 2 million of those in the last 2 years. Of that 5 million jobs, 1 million are professional technical people, designers, engineers, the people that are supposed to be the heart and soul of an innovation economy as we move forward. And in fact, we have been busy undermining it as quickly as we can with our trade, tax, and other policies. So that's the context in which we approach this. We've seen 50,000 manufacturing facilities close in that same time frame in the United States, while we racked up trade deficits that were running at $800 billion a year. And of those deficits, the manufactured goods, the goods part of this, has been over $850 billion. And the manufactured portion of that has been $536 billion. It's a huge number. It's a huge problem. It's a huge drain. And that is our innovation economy being drained away, and the loss of the opportunities and the closure of these facilities and the loss of these jobs. So that's part of the context in which we approach this situation. We set up a set of economic development principles to guide our way through this and think about it. I'm not going to walk through all of these, but I would just point out a couple here that then speak to where we come out on the domestic investment side. As you look down through this, if you look at that third bullet, we're very clear that the government should set goals for job creation and a clean environment, that's got to be a priority. That's got to meld these ideas that we will not choose between the environment and good jobs. We will choose that we want a clean environment and good jobs, and we will fight for both. But the government really needs to target that and target those opportunities. And then the next bullet absolutely makes sense. And following it says, domestic investment requirements need to be put in place. Buy American is one example. There are other examples of criteria and things in which you can help guide investment decisions. But the point is, spend the money in the economy, create these jobs, revitalize manufacturing as part of this process. Now, this is all part of this global discussion we've been in. And I just want to put this up here so everybody gets a clear picture of how we're working with the trade union movement throughout the world, the International Trade Union Confederation. We've been fighting for just transition language in the climate agreement. And what does that mean? Well, it simply means that we believe workers and their families should have a voice in their workplace, democratic rights in their workplace, and in their communities about climate change and what you do about it and how you deal with it. That's one fundamental point. The second is that we believe there has to be an aggressive investment program designed to create jobs, retain good jobs, and to raise per capita income. We have to deal with the social and political issues of the transition in climate as part of this puzzle. And to do that, you need to make these massive investments and aggressive investments over a long term to modernize your industries, not to chase them away, but to modernize them, to develop and deploy technology broadly, new technology, and to train and educate the workforce of our countries, every one of them. These are terms in which the developed world and the developing world can come to an agreement about what we want to do. And finally, we need to deal with the issues of people that are adversely affected by this transition, whether it's people who've lost their jobs through displacement or communities that have been affected because of climate itself and not just the regulations. So this is a big, broad umbrella in which we've talked about an economic development program for every country of the world. And frankly, all our unions, and you got to understand that every country in the world is doing this. And this is the agenda we're pushing in America. And you know what? If you go read the climate legislation, it's exactly what we've done. The aggressive investment packages that are associated with parts of it, ranging from carbon capture and sequestration to the electric car to renewable energy. And we did it in the Recovery Act as well. that we were trying to get a new carbon footprint and to address this investment pieces. And all the other pieces that are in the just transition language you see there appear in the U.S. legislation. It's not an alien concept. It's something we're fighting for here, and it's something that every country elsewhere is fighting for. Now, in the midst of all this, we also had the economic collapse of this country. And we are still in the midst of it and digging our way out. And it's going to be a long way till we see tomorrow in the situation we're in. The auto industry was just one viewpoint on this. But what it did do is make the country begin to make some serious decisions about who we are, what our national interest is. Do we want an automobile industry? And there is no other shared industry between Canada and the United States greater than the auto industry. I grew up in Detroit. I spent a lot of my youth in southern Ontario. The biggest border crossing in the world with the most trade going across it is the Ambassador Bridge in Detroit from the auto industry. So we have a common agenda in having an automobile industry in the United States and in Canada. But we had to make a decision. Are we going to do that as a country? I mean, we had to start thinking about things we haven't thought about in 30 years. It's called industrial policy. And for people who are offended by that term, I call it environmental economic development policy. About what do we want, what do we want to be, what's the national interest, and how to do it. We went to the Recovery Act with that in mind, both about changing the carbon footprint, but about the policies you need to put in place with that create good jobs, change our carbon footprint, and, frankly, make sure you recycle those dollars in the U.S. economy. And the Buy American Act and the enforcement and the broadening of it to capture the monies that go down to the state and local level are all part of it. It is all absolutely legal under WTO. And as David pointed out, everything we've done is WTO consistent. And one of the problems we've had between Canada and the United States is the fact that Canadians have not signed on to the procurement piece of this. That has created a problem at the state and local level, some of these things. It's not something that we've done that's wrong, but it's something that they chose not to do in the WTO context. And if their provinces had done so, we wouldn't be sitting here today with this argument. So I want to make that point because there's another thing that happens here in these kinds of trade discussions, that when you enforce a law like this, we found the EU ambassador running around the country saying, my God, they're creating trade wars, it's protectionism. We found the Canadian ambassador doing the same thing, when in fact the facts tell you a few things that may be a little different. And the bottom line of what Section 1605 of the Buy America portion of the Recovery Act simply said was that this section shall be applied in a manner consistent with the United States obligations under international agreements, and it's exactly what we have done. Now, you need to understand other countries also have things they waive in their agreements that are far broader than what the United States is covering under our Buy American legislation. And for example, these are the EU domestic content protections they put in place, which is all legal, but all things on transportation, telecommunications, and energy. And Canada's no different. They have done the same thing, and there's a long list of things that they have removed from the Act saying that they're protected under WTO to do so. And as I say, they're broader than what the United States actually has covered under what we have done. So I just make the point that, again, these are countries throughout the world thinking about domestic investment. What are the things that recycle dollars from our public monies into our economy and do that? Does the Buy American Act work? Well, this is pretty interesting because I think this is a picture that I've shown you here. One of the things that the EPA did under the Act is they said, well, you can have 5% set aside for miscellaneous things that might be cheap. You might go to a store and want to look at a bucket of screws and you don't know where they're really made, and that's what this 5% of the monies you could use for these incidental items were. Well, under that category at a project in Kentucky, they said those pipes were incidental items. I don't think you find those in an anonymous bin at Home Depot. We pointed it out to them that's not the case, and that there are other domestic manufacturers that make this rather than importing these goods. So we have a series of examples, and I left a Buy American piece out on the table out there that talks about myths and realities. And we have a series of examples of companies that made a difference. One was in Northwest Pennsylvania. This company called, got to read it. Got to put on my glasses here. Durfico Farrell in Northwest Pennsylvania, which is a Swiss-Russian firm that produced its product out of the Russian partners' slab steel they brought in from, shipped all the way from Russia to here. Wheatland Tube Company said, no, we need to have domestic content in that, and the company was able to oblige because we have plenty of slab steel in this country available at good price to be used in producing the products Wheatland Tube made for the Buy America Act. So it generated employment in this country, in the steel industry of the United States in doing so. There's another example that we have in there from a bridge that's being built in northern Minnesota, where they previously have been using a lot of imported content for their work. They've done it in this project. The project is coming in at $430,000 to build this little bridge rather than $600,000, and they've sourced it locally and created employment vis-a-vis that project. The other comes back to this example. One of the things that happened was a company, Star Corporation, said they would expand their lines, and this is one of the letters they wrote, for these piping products to meet the needs of the Buy American Act. And that's generating employment in the United States and creating good jobs with a company that expanded their production. We met with the EPA last week, it was 2 weeks ago now, to talk about their experience in implementing Buy America, because they hadn't had to do this before. We were talking up here earlier that's been mostly the Department of Transportation that people are used to, and this act now applied to another number of areas. And EPA said their experience had been pretty good. And then they started talking to us about examples of the difference they had made. And what they said was that they have an independent engineering consulting firm that also works with them on a third-party basis to help look at the proposals that come through. And they had targeted a number where they found big requests for waivers in them. And by the way, the law has waivers. If you can't find this stuff and it's not of quality or quantity, you can get a waiver. There's a series of ways to do this. So their experience was they had actually gone and looked at a number of cases and informed the people applying for the grant saying, you know, there really is domestic sourcing for this. And if we have one complaint with the implementation of Buy America is its lack of transparency. We now all have computers and the internet, and you can post waiver requests online instead of granting them and then writing them up in the Federal Register 2 weeks later and be subject to lawsuit. It's silly. And we continue to say, we're in this technological age in which we can do this. You can avoid those problems. You should do that. But they have found examples where they informed the grant requestors that there were opportunities to source domestically, and in fact it ended up happening, which is exactly what we wanted to happen. We wanted to expand their production like we saw at the Star Corporation in the United States. And each and every one of us have been around and watched the papers over the last 2 weeks. People ask me about, what about this Texas wind farm? And I keep saying to them, this is a real learning moment for a number of reasons. One, it was the intentions of the Recovery Act to actually stimulate the U.S. economy. And to address, as we did, as part of it, a new greener footprint as part of that. Now we have a Texas wind farm proposal that's going to be funded by the Chinese Exim Bank, at least for $1 billion of it, and they're seeking $450 million from the Recovery Act for the rest of it. And they actually went in a press conference and bragged that they would create 2,000 to 3,000 good, low-paid jobs in China, 300 temporary jobs in the United States, and then 30 permanent jobs operating and maintaining the equipment once it's installed. Now, frankly, that doesn't sound like a real good deal to me. I don't think it should to anybody in this room. And politically and economically, it's a terrible deal. If you want to talk about what we're going to do about climate change, you want to talk about the intent of the Recovery Act to stimulate the U.S. economy, this is not what you want to do. And so that's really posed this issue of what will we have going forward as our policies for investment. And I want to bring you back to a thought here in the midst of all this, because I absolutely believe we are headed for a large conflict in the what I want to say the WTO fantasy land, that all trade is free and everything, nothing should ever interfere with it. Every country in the world is seeking to do what we're trying to do on our Recovery Act. And we will continue to do so in other legislation around infrastructure and the green economy to seek to make sure we do it here and stimulate industry development in the United States to create those jobs. So is every other country in the world. That's my point about the just transition piece earlier. Don't lose sight of that. It is the desire of every government, every trade union in every country to deal with a climate crisis by investing in their own economies to create the jobs, to change that situation, and get something good out of it. And I think that whole desire and that whole drive is politically astute, economically correct, and it automatically runs in a conflict with the free trade advocates who think that all trade, no matter what it is, should never be interfered with. this is going to be a huge problem as the world moves to spend the biggest amount of money it's ever spent on a single goal in its history. We are in conflict between environmental and economic desires of communities and the rest of the world. I think that's going to be a problem that faces us, and the microcosm comes down to Buy America in our first application at trying to do this. And when we did, we were immediately accused of being protectionist and starting trade wars, none of which was true. I think it really speaks towards what we're trying to do. We have no intention of ending up in the dustbin of history with American manufacturing in the American middle class. And to do that, we actually need to think about acting as our other countries do in terms of thinking about our economy, thinking about our industries, which ones we really need to stimulate, the technologies that portend the future, and capturing those and moving ahead with those, and being the innovation economy that we want to be and should be. And that's why we actually say we want a cleaner planet and good jobs, and we are pushing to have the production and construction made in this country so that, in fact, we are viable and leave a better legacy for our children and their grandchildren. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bob. Dawn, we'll tee up your...
Okay. Well, while she's putting that up, good morning, and thank you for the opportunity to present the views of our organization with regard to the Buy American provision in the Recovery Act, particularly as it's impacted the water and wastewater industry and the member companies that we represent. As David said, WEIMA is a 101-year-old national nonprofit trade association representing Northern American companies that manufacture and supply products sold to municipal and utility interests for both wastewater and drinking water applications worldwide. Our member companies range from small to mid-sized firms dominantly. All of them, with the exception of possibly one, is a U.S.-owned company. And they make very highly sophisticated technologies using specialty parts and components sourced from throughout the world to provide the technologies that our municipalities have come to rely upon to meet their water and wastewater treatment needs. Let me go on record at the very start to say that our organization fully supports the goals of the Recovery Act: to create U.S. jobs, to stimulate U.S. economy, and to help the U.S. manufacturing base. Thank you for reminding me. That's what we all want. But to do that in such a way that prohibits us from being able to provide the most cost-effective and expedient products as is required by the Recovery Act, and to create procurement requirements imposed upon our industry for the first time that potentially jeopardizes our U.S. companies' ability to compete abroad, which is very real, we feel will only cost U.S. jobs and delay our economic recovery. This, we feel, is due in large part to the unintended consequences of the dramatic expansion of the Buy American Act in the Recovery Act, Buy American provision in the Recovery Act. Now, let me put this in perspective as it relates to our industry particularly. Under the stimulus bill, we were given $6 billion this year through a federal government agency, the US EPA, to provide monies to states that can then lend out the monies either through grants or loans to our municipalities for both their water and wastewater needs. The funds are being administered through the existing Clean Water and Drinking Water State Revolving Fund programs, very successful programs that have made a great deal of improvements for our U.S. infrastructure. And we also received $1.38 billion through the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Rural Utility Services Water and Waste Loan and Grant Program. Those monies will be going to communities serving under 10,000 population to help them address their water and wastewater needs. Both of these programs, for the first time, are being subject to a Buy American provision in the Section 1605 of the Recovery Act that is vast and confusing departure from the traditional application of the Buy American Act of 1933. It mandates that 100% of all iron and steel must be domestically produced, as well as manufactured goods, which have not been traditionally subject to these types of requirements. Also, a less restrictive variation of the rule, setting the threshold at 51%, has long existed for federal projects, but in this case today we are facing a 100% requirement at the municipal level. This act also expands the application of the American restriction by eliminating the long-used unreasonable cost criteria, substituting instead that in order for that unreasonable cost criteria to take effect, using a foreign source material or product would have to increase the entire project by 25%, not the product. Amazingly broader expansion than we've ever had to deal with. I'm not very good at keeping up with these things, so it'll catch up with me eventually. I was in Palm Beach Gardens, Florida this last week attending WEIMA's 101st annual meeting. And just up the road, about 80 miles north of Palm Beach, I discovered that there was a town that is just lost $10 million in stimulus funds because they were told by a Florida State Department of Environmental Protection agent or official that they could indeed use a foreign-made steel castings pipe at a 56% savings for a total savings of $362,000 to that community, under the understanding by that Florida state official that the unreasonable cost would allow for that because it's 56% more than the domestic supplier. Mass confusion. To this day, 9 months later, people still don't quite understand how to interpret these rules. Now, while federal agencies are well accustomed and equipped to deal with this very substantial bureaucratic red tape that comes with this new procurement requirement, not new for the federal government, new for municipalities, few states and local governments have had to deal with it. The administrative requirements, the legal requirements that come with regulating this complicated mandate. The resulting confusion and uncertainty has caused a number of state, county, and municipal projects to basically come to a grinding halt, especially in the water and wastewater industry. I think these numbers will be telling. These are figures that we just got last week at our annual conference. EPA anticipates with the $6 billion they are to receive for water and wastewater projects that 1,512 clean water, which is also known as wastewater projects, and 1,425 drinking water projects will ultimately get funded with the stimulus monies. But keep in mind, those monies have to be either given to projects that are under contract or under construction by February 17th of this coming year. Failure to do that, the funds that are remaining in that state will have to be sent back to the general fund and redistributed to the other states that were successful in spending their money. So we're looking at a very, very tight timeline to meet that requirement. As of August 30th, almost 8 months into the beginning of this act's implementation, 7 states and D.C. had yet to even put a project out to bid. Projects aren't moving. They've come to a grinding halt in our industry. Jobs are not being created. It has actually stifled our ability to continue doing business as we have been doing up till this time. More current numbers. As of November 9th of this year, EPA, I was pleased to report, said that they have $2.57 billion of the $6 billion in funds committed to projects under contract or under construction. But that leaves another 57% or $3.43 billion in monies that have yet to go to the bidding process. That we have between now and November 17th, today's the 17th, we've got 3 months to get 57% of our monies committed to projects under contract or under construction. Anyone who knows the public procurement process knows that 3 months is about as tight as you can make it. It takes that long to get the bids out on the market, to evaluate them, to make final determinations, and to award contracts. So unless our industry this week, before Thanksgiving, takes on an enormous task of trying to move this much money into these projects, I fear those monies will be lost to those communities. The engineers are not seeing an uptick in business. I was with the general contractors in Florida last week. They turned to the manufacturers and saying, hey, are you guys seeing some business going on out there? Because we haven't seen it. We're like, you're the ones who specify us, and you're the ones who we bid to. Surely, if you haven't seen it, we haven't seen it as the manufacturers. So there's a disconnect between this onslaught of projects that are supposed to be coming out through the pipelines, and bidding activity is supposed to be occurring. Nobody's canceling their Thanksgiving vacations right now because they just don't see much going on. Where's the money? I think an important note to consider when you talk about where the money is, for every $1 billion in stimulus money that is not being spent, it equates to 34,776 jobs that are not being maintained or created, as well as $6.2 billion in related economic activity that is not occurring. So if you look at what's left in our program, $3.43 billion money has not been spent. That would equate to a total of 120,000 jobs that we should have created by now or in the midst of creating, and economic activity of $21 billion that hasn't occurred. And I submit to you, the reason that it has not occurred is because of the Buy American provision of this Recovery Act that has been placed upon municipalities for their first time. So why the huge delay in getting money out and projects started and jobs created? Communities with shovel-ready projects, and they were there come January this year, have had to take them back to the drawing board to see, first, do we now comply with Buy American? And if not, can we find domestic suppliers that we can utilize instead of who we had already considered using? And if we can't, can we get waivers so we can continue doing business with the companies that we've come to rely upon, whose products we have come to use for many years, to move these projects forward? Now, Bob is correct. Waivers are indeed available under this program for those rare situations. But they have rarely been used, much to our surprise as well, how rare they're used. Primarily due to the fact that it's time-consuming, and there's a huge fear of backlash once these waivers are published, because you're not going pure American. To date, of the 3,000 projects that EPA plans to fund under the $6 billion that they got, they have received a total whopping 26 clean water waiver requests and 11 drinking water waiver requests, of which 20 have been approved, 2 were denied, the balance are under review. That's about 1% of all the projects out there have requested waivers, which seems remarkable because I can tell you that a significant amount of products used in those plants encompass parts and materials and specialty items from across the world, because we are a global community. We work through global supply chains. So again, you have to ask yourself, what's the problem? The February 17th deadline, keep that in mind. For our industry, that's fairly unique. It's in the law. We have to meet that deadline. We were told by an EPA official at our meeting last week that one of the state directors actually told his communities, if you can't buy American supplier, if you can't find American supplier, find another project to bring to me to be financed. Don't make it complicated. We're out of time. Another concern for the avoidance of waivers is the risk adversity that has occurred in our marketplace as a result of this procurement restriction. Municipalities are reluctant to consider producers and companies, even if they're U.S. companies that would be and truly eligible to sell to these projects. If there's any doubt in mind, they're adverse to using them because there are significant criminal and civil liabilities associated with failure to meet this rule, which I don't in any way disagree with. There should be, there needs to be. But that certainly has had a chilling effect on any risk-taking in our industry. Local governments, again, are unaccustomed to how they deal with these new requirements. So they take the cautious route. The situation actually is even more dire in the U.S. Department of Agriculture's program. The Secretary of Ag has said explicitly, if there is any waiver that's going to come through our department, it's going to come to my desk. I will be the one to personally sign that waiver. Well, I can guarantee you that it'll be the rare exception when anyone below his office decides to bring a waiver up for his consideration. It would have to be one hell of a convincing case to spend his time to have to review and sign off on that. So the confusion surrounding this rule, I cannot tell you. I can't emphasize how challenging it's been. To this very day, here we are, 10 months into the program, I'm still getting calls from suppliers convinced that they can sell to our municipal government because they come from Sweden and we have WTO agreements, or they come from Canada, of course, we've got NAFTA. And I have to remind them over and over, if you're selling to federal projects, God bless you, go. But if it's at the municipal level, don't do business here. It's not going to play. Again, U.S. companies are being harmed by this. One example is a company called A.Y. McDonald Manufacturing out of Dubuque, Iowa. They own a Canadian subsidiary called Cambridge Brass, based in Ontario. They stand to lose $1.4 billion in providing fittings to a residential water project in Sacramento. $100,000 of these fittings have already been purchased and installed underground, and now the contractor's been told, take it out. It says made in Canada. Hundreds of former Stelco, now U.S. Steel employees have been laid off because they can't sell their products to America. I found it interesting, a statistic that U.S. exported approximately 9 million tons of steel in 2007. So the risk to American steel workers, just as to many of our member companies, is potentially greater than or equal to or greater than the gains that may be realized from this Buy American provision. But the greatest harm still lies ahead, in our opinion, and that is not only that countries have already started their own binational requirements, but that they may take true restrictive retaliation measures as a result of what we are doing with our Buy American rule. Once again, the numbers speak for themselves. 95% of the world's economy is outside of the United States. Exports count for nearly 60% of our economic growth in the United States. Every $8 earned by Americans last year. 42% of American jobs are dependent on trade. More than 7 million Americans owe their livelihood to Canada, the business that we have in Canada. This statistics, this one always catches me. Canada buys four times the products from America than does China. And in fact, Canada buys more products from America than China, Canada, the UK, and Germany combined. It's a huge marketing venue for our U.S. exports. 45% of all materials and products purchased in U.S. Canada come from the United States, so it goes both ways. Our two economies are profoundly linked. An artificial restriction on our ability to do trade will be a job killer truly for both of our countries, in our opinion. Canada has put forth a historic proposal, the first, I understand, in 142 years, that the territorial and provincial leaders have gotten together and come up with a procurement proposal to open up access to their provincial and municipal procurement markets to U.S. companies in exchange for this one-time relief from the Buy American provision under our stimulus bill. And they've also promised to enter into bilateral negotiations to make it a more permanent and even broader opening of their markets between the United States and Canada. My fear is that if our negotiation teams fail and we don't get rid of this trade impediment, it'll send a chilling message to not only Canada but to other economies around the globe that we are not open for business. And we do take seriously the fear of retaliation that will no doubt occur. So what's in it for us? Of the $39 billion of Canada's public works spending in 2008, $4 billion was for water and wastewater. Now, infrastructure is expected to increase to $64.7 billion by 2012 in Canada. If you add the $52 billion that Canada is spending right now in stimulus funds for infrastructure, you're looking at $300 billion over the next 5 years in Canadian infrastructure investments, of which $30 to $40 billion will be for the water and wastewater market. We typically get about 60% of that business. not unsubstantial. I have U.S. companies that were anticipating expanding their sales force, but have put that on a halt because they don't know if that market's going to come to fruition. If other nations were to implement a binational requirement like we have, it has the potential of locking U.S. companies out of, say, if just 1% of the worldwide stimulus funds we cannot tap into, we have the risk of losing 170,000 jobs, or 170,000 jobs will not be created had we had access to those programs. So in summary, we feel the expansion of the Buy American provision has had an anti-stimulus effect on the economy and our job market, and has hurt U.S. companies and threatens to damage our ability to support job creation through exports. How do you create jobs by restricting trade? We create business opportunities by keeping markets open and being competitive, especially as an integrated North American market and economy. We don't need to buy American. We need to sell American by being competitive, especially with our colleagues in Canada. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Don. Moving right along, we'll head over to Chris.
Steal your clicker there.
Clicker.
Thank you. Okay. How do I get this to come up? There we go. Great. Well, I guess my role in this is to kind of figure out where the states fit into the broader Buy America and debate, and how it connects to what is the single largest domestic spending bill in U.S. history. And by way of introduction, what's important to remember is we're just moving through a really critical period of our own federal system. On the one hand, you've got states that are in the midst of the worst fiscal crisis they have ever faced. Even after you take the money they received that helped them in their budget crisis from the Recovery Act, they cumulatively, looking forward for the next 2 fiscal years, face at least $350 billion of cumulative deficits across the 50 states. So you got that going on. And at the same time, when we chose to kind of pull the trigger on our national response to this economic crisis, the instrumentality used was the state-federal partnership. When we were here before with the New Deal, it was all about federal agencies. It was the Works Progress Administration, the Civilian Conservation Corps. It was the federal government creating federal agencies staffed by federal officials who were the primary instrument of our national response. Now it's the states. It's the state-federal partnership. So on the one hand, you've got the states who've been made the driver of our national response to this huge Great Recession that we're still in the midst of, but the wheels are coming off the bus at the same time. So what I want to do is just kind of give you some 50,000-foot perspective on what the Recovery Act means for the states. Then I'm going to touch upon kind of the role of states in trade policy and how what capacities they have to implement things like the Buy America provisions. And then I'll just kind of close out by talking about how if we can kind of get beyond some of these frictions and think more long term about what needs to be done on economic development, what the future could look like both for states as economic entities and in terms of their collaboration with our Canadian partners. So just to give you the very broad brush, anyone who listened to the debate on the Recovery Act in December of last year, January of this year, it seems like a decade ago to me, but if you were there in the midst of that moment where, running up to the election just a year ago, we were talking more about a $300 billion stimulus. By the time that you get to the first of the year, it's up to $600 billion, and then just a week before inauguration, Obama's talking about a $750 billion stimulus package, but we had no idea what was going to be in that. And quite frankly, if you listen to the debate, it was all about shovel-ready projects. You would have assumed that we were preparing to spend $800 billion on asphalt. Well, in the end, it was all of these large, complex items. You got a tax title, which I'll leave it to the economists, but probably is having more economic impact than anything else right now, but has had very little political impact because instead of giving people $300 refund checks, they're getting another $20 or $40 in their pay packet every 2 weeks or so. So it hasn't had the splash that giving everybody a refund check would get. You've got the actual stimulus spending, the real stuff that's designed to get money into projects and rattling around in the economy quickly. You've got over $100 billion that is really designed for the reinvestment side of the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. And then you've got a whole bunch of money that's designed to blunt that state fiscal crisis, but not solve it. And really, it has played a key role. It's taken about 30% of a catastrophic budget crisis off the table, but you leave that 70% and states are still in a world of hurt. Now, this is a huge, complex slide, so largely ignore it. But what I'm trying to say out of this, if you were able to read those tiny fine prints, is that we are in a real peak moment in terms of the procurement side of the state role in the Recovery Act. What this are the amounts of money that the states along the U.S.-Canada border have received and how much they put under contract. And it ranges between 10% and 40%. So that means that of the amounts awarded to the border states, that between 10 and 40% has already been obligated, put under contract, and is out there doing great things. So really the next 3 months probably is going to be the peak moment of government procurement within the Recovery Act. We haven't missed for those of our Canadian partners who are really eager to get an agreement worked out, and our own industry partners who feel the same way, the horse hasn't left the barn. It's not too late to have an impact on this huge opportunity in terms of the government procurement that's going on. But that moment's coming soon, that we really are at the peak. Now, in terms of, and one slide I probably already clicked over, but the reason that government procurement peak is so large and is such of importance right now is that of the $500 billion roughly of procurement in the Recovery Act, roughly 60% of that is either going to go through states, be touched by states in one form or another. Roughly $300 billion will have a state dimension to it. So states are the driver, as I said before. Only 1% of that goes directly to locals. Now, Don would note correctly that even though that 60% of that is going through states, they often subrecipient down to the locals. So the locals are a key component of this. But when you look at the largest volume of procurement, it's ultimately a state story. Now, in terms of how Buy America comes into this, Canadian provinces are incredibly sophisticated players in global trade policy. It's in part the nature of the federal system in Canada and the fact that provinces have powers, responsibilities, and staff capacities that exceed our own states. But for whatever reason, when you look to states and their ability to figure out whether how to implement the Buy America provisions or any other element of U.S. trade policy. A lot of the discussion around Buy America goes back to the government procurement agreement of the WTO and the fact that states signed on to it and provinces didn't. Well, of the 37 states that obligated themselves 15 years ago, if you were to go out and interview procurement offices in those 50 states, or just the 37 that signed on, the majority of them have no idea they did sign on. There's been absolutely no outreach to the states in the period between the Uruguay round and today in terms of ensuring that states meet their own obligations. In fact, when we negotiate free trade agreements and you look into the very back pages of them, all those FTAs that were negotiated in the Bush administration, and you look at non-conforming measures, a whole bunch of them are state laws. All of them are 15 years old. No one's gone back and checked with the states to see if they've done anything in their own procurement practices or any other potential non-conforming measure that does not conflict with our existing trade obligations. And in part, it's a twofold problem. States themselves don't see enough skin in the game in trade policy to invest in their own trade capacity. There are exactly 3 trade policy specialists in all of state government in America. New York has one. Washington State has one. Washington State hired theirs because Seattle blew up on them when they had a WTO meeting. And then Pennsylvania just hired one within the last couple of years. Only one of those is an attorney. The others are policy generalists who cover many other issues on top of it. The province of Ontario has 12 trade policy specialists in their Ministry of Intergovernmental Affairs. So there's a disconnect between the ability of states to consider how these trade policies and government procurement obligations affect them, and also just to see where their own liabilities lay in implementing trade policy. And that comes down to where the rubber meets the road on that with regard to this specific discussion is, the decisions will be made at the federal level. It's not that the states are being asked to look into themselves and decide what aspects of government procurement that they would be willing to offer up. Now, on the Canadian side, that is happening. There is this real dialogue between municipalities and provinces and their own federal government. But for us as states, it's a question of what our own feds agree to and then how you roll it out. Well, I can tell you that in the first 6 weeks after the Recovery Act was passed, when we were on the phone on these biweekly conference calls with OMB on just the rollout of recovery dollars and what had to be put in place in terms of the accountability and transparency requirements under this legislation, which are more extensive than anything the states have ever had to deal with before, there was a huge discussion on Buy America. There was this sense of we got to get contracts out the door, and how do we do it? And we, other than our transport folks, we've never had to do it before in our state energy program or wastewater or anything like that. And that was a huge friction point, just making sure that you were in compliance with the agreement itself and getting the contracts in place. Now, they did it by, taking the contract models that the highway departments have been dealing with since 1982 in the Buy America Act, and just kind of echoing them out forward into all of these other contract instruments that states are dealing with 42 separate major program accounts. Now, if this agreement is inked, there's going to be a huge challenge to turn around that the momentum that's involved with that, because we're at this peak procurement moment. Someone's got to say, hold the press. You need to change all your contract instruments because there's an awful lot of inertia that goes in, especially now that we're a year into this. So I think that there's a huge need for OMB in particular to play a technical assistance role on that. And if I were if I were working for the Canadian Embassy, I would be as interested in having a dialogue with OMB as I would be on the USTR side. USTR doesn't have the staff capacity or the historical interest in playing a role on the state implementation side of something like this. OMB and GAO combined have had folks deployed out in state capitals, and those really need to be the instrumentality of helping states respond to an agreement should an agreement take place. But I'd go even further, in the sense that since provinces have this capacity, provinces have an ability to understand trade obligations that states hold better than the states themselves know. If I were in Ontario or Quebec or BC and was working with my own suppliers and vendors to hopefully get them into markets once an agreement takes place, if it should, I'd have my lawyers on a plane to go talk with the government procurement officials there, not to instigate litigation or to scare anybody. But I think that actually the capacity level in states on understanding these obligations are so low that it's in your own interest to help your own suppliers, if an agreement takes place, to help educate your counterparts. Now, let's say it all gets solved and we move forward for the next year in terms of implementing the Recovery Act. What does this mean beyond just a shot of adrenaline in the arm of a sick patient? And most of our public discussion around the Recovery Act are just that. How many contracts are out there, how much spending has taken place, and how many jobs can be counted based on what's been done so far. And that challenge alone is all-consuming in state capitals. But there is that other $100 billion reinvestment dimension to the Recovery Act, which is about longer-term economic growth. And even if you just take the kind of stimulus line items in those 40 lanes of funding that every state has, if you use them creatively and collaboratively, you could hopefully create something more out of the Recovery Act than just a shot of adrenaline in the arm of the sick patient. But right now, states are kind of under a disincentive to do so. I mean, the message from the White House from the beginning has been, we're going to watch you and shame you if you do anything to step out of line in your spending here. And as a result, the primary focus in states is kind of an IG function. If you look at these state stimulus czars and stuff like that, often they come from the Attorney General community. And rightly so, the expectation of the American public is this money should be spent in accordance with the law, and that people, don't create the kind of mafia museums and pools and projects that got the negative attention prior to enactment. But meanwhile, there's a lot less political attention from the White House, from the State House, or from anybody else on how you can combine all of these different streams of funding you have and pair them up with the competitive grant money, which everyone seems to be largely ignoring at the state level right now because you can't look specifically at a spreadsheet and see how much you're going to get, and hopefully build something more lasting along the lines of what Bob was proposing in terms of the interest of the AFL-CIO in the Recovery Act. But I think there are models you can look to. I think that there are states that I'm starting to get hopeful about. There are prospects of using these monies more creatively to build something lasting that I think would also be of a benefit to our Canadian partners. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to fast forward one more slide to give you a specific example. All right. I mentioned two different examples of the federal largesse playing a role in transformation in a state or local economy. The first is the Riverwalk. Most people have probably either been there or heard about it. It began as a $300,000 Works Progress Administration grant in 1939. And now the Riverwalk, well, and that grant, just to be specific, was just canalizing the river, pouring the concrete to turn a floodplain into the channel that you see today. It involved a lot more private investment, a lot more public investment by the city of San Antonio over many years, but that was the seed of what is now a $10 billion tourism and convention bureau industry in San Antonio, the single largest tourism asset for the state of Texas. To me, that is a transformational public investment. And if you look at all the specific New Deal investments, there might be one that beats that, but this one has to be in the winner's circle in terms of a $300,000 grant, ultimately over 60 years or so becoming the linchpin of this huge industry. It's also a great example of what you're not going to get out of the Recovery Act. Mm-hmm. There just isn't enough infrastructure in there, that even the figures Don was using, about $6 billion in wastewater and drinking water. Well, that's great. $6 billion is a lot of money, but relative to the size of this national response, it's minuscule. In fact, depending on how you slice it and dice it, it's about $40 billion or so out of the total Recovery Act that is real kind of hardcore infrastructure that we would think of in kind of a New Deal context. So we're not making enough bets in terms of infrastructure investment to hopefully lead to the kind of payoff that ultimately transpired over many decades with the Riverwalk. But there are other examples that I think are far more relevant to the kind of monies that are flowing out of the Recovery Act, and that's where we talk about the Research Triangle Park. Most people know about it. You got about 40,000 outstandingly well-paid jobs in the Greater Research Triangle Park area in North Carolina. But really, 50 years ago, this was a concept waiting to happen. You had a great governor in North Carolina in the mid-'50s called Luther Hodges. He went on to be the Secretary of Commerce for President Kennedy. Came up with a concept of trying to take what was then really kind of a late 19th century economy and propel it hopefully into the 20th century. Worked with the presidents of the three major universities in the state and with a whole bunch of local leaders who had to make some very key zoning decisions. And they came up with a concept of attracting all this high-tech research to this geographic area. Well, everyone comes up with concepts like that. They all sound good, and yes, they got the political consensus around it, but it would have gone nowhere but for the fact that Sputnik goes into orbit in 1957 and the sluice gates of federal funding for high-tech research open up, and they were perfectly positioned to become a major funded element, those three research institutions, for all of the NASA monies and other National Science Foundation monies and other things that came out of the space race. That's a far more a far better example of what is potentially available out of the Recovery Act to states right now than the Riverwalk example. You have over $20 billion in grants opportunities in biomedical, high-tech research. You've got over $25 billion in kind of new energy economy investment of various forms. The states that are going to achieve the most out of this, that hopefully over time time will lead to an outcome like the Research Triangle Park are going to be the states that creatively use both of their formula-funded monies, the stimulus monies in those 40 lanes, and all of these competitive grant opportunities. And to do that right, those who are along the border, places like Michigan, which are in the heart of the fight in terms of having to reinvent themselves, I think are going to need to do it in collaboration with their Canadian partners. And quite frankly, a lot of the states that I'm watching in terms of my own hopes are in places that aren't that far from the Canadian border. If I had to bet on anyone right now, I'd bet on Oregon, where Bob has some roots. If I had to hope for anyone and just hope based on the crisis they're in, I'd hope for Michigan. So I think that solving this challenge in terms of working out whether we form some sort of compromise on Buy America is helpful in positioning states for this broader reinvention challenge, in that if you can go beyond the strictures that they're in terms of their procurement now, they can also look beyond just their own institutions in terms of the research partnerships, in terms of the broader economic development strategies that they need to form regionally with partnering states but also partnering provinces. Our own organization just came out of our annual meeting. We adopted a resolution in favor of reaching some sort of an agreement. It's largely a very loose resolution. We have plenty of state leaders who are concerned about the labor dimensions of this along the lines that Bob laid out. But at the same time, there is this sense that the complexity of meeting the challenges of implementing your procurement and finding collaborations that are in your economic advantages are something that the majority of state leaders would like to see worked out in the context of an agreement between our two governments. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Chris. Okay, and last but not least, Jeff Schott.
Well, thank you very much, and I apologize for coming late to the panel and to the audience. Perhaps if the stimulus funds had been deployed efficiently in Northern Virginia, there wouldn't be the transportation bottlenecks that kept me on the road all morning. Well, you've heard three wonderful presentations, really rich in substance, and there's not much I can add to their experience and the problems and opportunities and ideas for moving forward that they've presented. Let me spend just a very little bit of time relaying some thoughts from my experience with this subject that goes back 35 years to the negotiation of the original government procurement code in the OECD. That's when these international rules began, and that negotiation was transferred to Geneva and became the GATT agreement on government procurement. The reason countries got together at that time to try to discipline government procurement practices was because they wanted to constrain the special interest lobbying by companies and labor unions that were making it more difficult to use government procurement efficiently, and therefore to stimulate the economy and create jobs. You can always give subsidies and buy jobs at the expense of another sector of your own economy. But the real challenge is how to use the procurement to enhance productivity so that you have a more permanent level of economic activity, economic growth, that then creates the situation where you can have more jobs on a permanent basis. And that's the challenge we have, and I think a number of the comments today indicate that we haven't been going about this very, very well over the past year. Now, the purpose of binational programs, very attractive to politicians, is to subsidize local firms. That's what it's about. And basically support and bolster local employment. And governments subsidize firms in a number of ways. The whole tax code is a basic way of subsidizing certain activities and discriminating against other types of activities in our economy. And that discrimination is among firms in our economy and between our firms and foreign suppliers to the U.S. market. But of course, in an era of globalization, you can't make that fine a distinction between what's an American firm, what's an American product, and what's a foreign supplied product. And that's where some of the problems have come about. And I think the lawyers have done us a disservice by talking about what's legal and what's illegal. The WTO obligations are not very comprehensive. So it's unclear whether there are WTO violations or even NAFTA violations. Though one can make strong arguments on both sides saying that these stimulus funds are really federal funds mandating certain projects which are directed by the Congress, and the implementation is being done by the states. But, you can argue that for a long time. You can file cases in the WTO or the NAFTA, and 3 or 4 years later, you'll get an inconclusive result. So that's not going to help the purpose that we want, which is to stimulate the economy and to dig out of this big hole of unemployment that has built up as a result of the very deep recession that we've suffered in over the past year. So it doesn't. The legal issue I'm going to bypass. There is a lot of protectionism that's WTO legal, and some of it is under the cloak of binational. It is protectionist in the sense that it does restrict the ability to use funds in as productive as way as they should, but so are a lot of programs that reallocate resources among the economy, and that's the purpose of government, to decide which activities get priority and which are discriminated against. That's why we elect the officials of Congress to do the wonderful things that they do. Now, what are the problems with the Buy American? You would think that it's on budget. They're allocated funds, so there should be some discipline. But as others have said, there's very little transparency, particularly when you move from the federal to the state level. And even though there are waiver authorities, as Dawn said, nobody has the sense to figure out what they are or how to use them. Bob even admitted that there would be much better ways of deploying waiver authorities that would make them a real option, but right now they're not a real option. So what we've seen is it's raised the cost of public procurement because of the premia of the domestic preference margin that governments are forced to pay for the projects, and so you get less bang for the buck. You have less, the higher cost projects, fewer projects because of the delays and the like. We usually are willing to pay a premium for certain types of procurement. Certainly for defense, certainly for homeland security, we do that. When you get into the area of economic stimulus, you have to weigh the short-term stimulus and the addition to local employment from the diversion of activity and the diversion of employment that come from the added costs and the delays in the procurement cycle. So it's not clear how much benefit you really get, and I'll get back to that in a moment. Clearly, there are delays in the procurement process. The numbers that Dawn and Chris have mentioned are just startling. We've gone through 10 months of this program. The 10 months when our economy was in the tank. Now we're trending up for possible 4% growth in 2010, and only at that point are we going to begin to start the stimulus funding. when the projects will be working into an economy that is beginning to heat up already. A real lost opportunity to get things going when people were suffering and avoid the 10.2% unemployment that we now face. If we hadn't let politics muck up the job so badly to interfere with the procurement process and getting some of these projects going. Another problem, emulation, and this has been mentioned on several occasions. The Chinese came out front and center and said very bluntly that they were going to discriminate against U.S. sourced goods in Chinese procurement, and they did. And it took some effort by our officials to go and some political capital to get them to reverse some of those provisions with regard to provincial procurement. That's only beginning to loosen up now. The story on the Canadian municipalities is well known. But the negotiation that's currently going on between the USTR and Canada is focusing on the stimulus funds and only rules for the stimulus funds. And as the others have said, that window is going to close very, very quickly. And it's a limited amount of money anyway. And since we have already an integrated regional market and integrated firms and supply chains, it would make sense if the negotiators went and said, well, this is an area where we really need to expand NAFTA access and talk about North American content rather than by American. That may follow. But it's certainly much more controversial at a period when you're facing 10.2% unemployment. Now, there is a bigger problem on emulation than the Chinese or the Canadians. And the emulation occurs in the Congress. And it's not related to the stimulus, but it's related to every other little piece of legislation that the members of Congress consider, where they say, well, if it worked, if we have this precedent from the economic stimulus, why not put it in every other piece of legislation and every other procurement that the program that the United States is considering? And so you have nothing that has been legislated yet. Has been passed yet, but a lot of bills that contain similar types of Buy American provisions that are going to create these distortions well after our economy recovers and probably contributes to going back into a double-dip recession. Now, I was going to talk about the state and federal projects and the segmentation of the projects between state and federal government and states, but Dawn and Chris really spelled that out very clearly for you. And the confusion that has been created by implementing regulations and the difficulty in applying waiver provisions. I think Chris made a wonderful point about the fiscal situation in the states. State officials can't take the risk of losing a penny of federal funds. And so when in doubt, state and local officials have been extremely risk-averse for fear of losing all their federal funding. And so there isn't even a consideration of whether this is 100% American or not, or whether the waiver provisions should apply. If there's any doubt, forget about it. Let's just go with the higher priced, lower quality sometimes higher quality, higher priced tendering. But what has been clear is that this has been a contributing factor to the delay in the tendering process, which has been very costly in terms of economic stimulus. So then the final point. For all this trouble does the government procurement discrimination actually make a significant difference with regard to increase in U.S. jobs? As an economist, I don't think you can find many economists who would say it makes any significant difference at all. And particularly not after factoring in the delays in the procurement, less bang for the procurement buck, the foreign emulation affecting U.S. exports, reducing U.S. exports, and suppliers switching by private U.S. firms. Maybe that was one point that hasn't come up so far. If you distort the supplier relationships and firms that and higher cost firms win the government contracts, then the firms that would otherwise be supplying the government will have other projects in which they are able to supply. And so you may have a switching of suppliers, private firms buying from the steel makers or others that are producing. I don't know if there's much additionality that comes about it. Certainly, a loss of efficiency. So, in sum, what I conclude is you may see some examples, some segments of the economy where there is an uptick in employment. Probably mostly at the cost of less economic activity elsewhere in the U.S. economy. And in my view, the slower pace of recovery has had a far greater impact, negative impact, on U.S. employment than the diversion of contracts to local firms and the increase in employment by those local firms from the small amount of procurement contracts that have been let. Thank you.
Well, thank you, panel. This was a really comprehensive view of a rather complicated issue. Bob talking about the need of the recovery in the country, and Dawn about her industry, and Chris about the states, and Jeff about the overall economics. Before we go to you folks, but I know you have some questions, I'd like to see if either of the panelists would like to comment, question another before we turn to you.
Yeah, just a couple comments. If you think the delays and everything are related just to Buy American, think again. We need to talk pretty honestly about this. The funds for infrastructure had dried up in this country, and all of a sudden we came along with, as was pointed out, the largest investment package that anybody's ever seen to do this. And it moved it into a system in which there really wasn't an infrastructure to move public projects in the way they should be. Now, some of this delay and some of the questions and concerns, we've heard them too, about Buy American, how does it work, and we think we've engaged with EPA and other agencies around this about to make it more efficient and the ways to do that and to move the money. But don't assume that every delay that's out there is related to this. And we don't see a problem, and EPA doesn't see a problem, that when you have a laundry list of priority projects in a state and you find one you can move that easily meets the requirements of the Act and it moves to the headline and gets funded, move it, get it done. And you know what? And then people actually have built an infrastructure to address these issues going forward with other legislation, which I can assure you we're going to be working to make sure that pursues domestic investment strategy as part of it. Secondly, emulation. Let's be real here. There's 4.5 trillion in trade, two-way trade the United States engage in. You're not going to see a hell of a lot of emulation. And in fact, if you want to talk about China, they just announced what they were already been practicing for years around this. So this was, their announced Buy in China policy was in fact what they've had engaged in directly for many, many, many years. And if you don't pay attention to what their strategies and policies are in industrial policy, I urge you to go and hear the findings of the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission on Thursday, which its new report comes out that talks about the industrial policies and practices, of which this is just one that has been in place for a long time, of how they protect their markets. And frankly, China is not part of the procurement agreement anyway to begin with. Neither are a number of other countries. There's 39 signatories to that. So I think you have to be more honest about this. And I actually said, as I tried to point out, that the fight over Buy America in the Recovery Act is really about a much larger question for this country, about how we are going to spend resources going forward and how we are going to engage in looking at our country and economy that have critical industries, that want a manufacturing base, that are critical technologies out there that we actually want to have made here, both for national security purposes as well as economic development purposes. And I think that's all part of this puzzle. So in summary, I would just say that the emulation thing, I think in the greater scheme of things where trade is, nobody's going to jeopardize $4.5 trillion in trade, which is mostly private. It's not about the public procurement piece at all. So let's be realistic about that and not overstate the case. And secondly, we have to look at the infrastructure for developing on these projects to begin with, of which Buy America has been part of it. But today it's been taking the whole blame for every delay that's in this process, and I don't believe that's accurate. Anyone else?
Could I quickly respond to just 2 points? First, we have intended use plans within each state of projects that need to be funded through the very limited federal funds that's available. And part of those plans are based on need and water quality impact, public health impact, as well as able to move forward. So to have to force our states to then go down the shopping list and say, let's find the most neutral, basic infrastructure project that can move forward, which pretty much takes you out of the treatment train side and puts you more in the digging pipes and filling pipes, then I think we've done a disservice by taking that right away from the states to be able to fund exactly what they know they need to do now that's most important for the public health. So I just leave that thought, and I would never suggest that Buy America was the cause for. I don't think any one provision could have that much of a detrimental impact to see how little of the funds have moved forward. Maybe if it had, it would have gotten a little more attention on Capitol Hill. The other thing, I'm not a trade lawyer, so I advise our federal government on trade policies, and sometimes I wonder why they ask me because I really don't have the legal background. But the WTO is an area that does sort of confuse me because I know that I don't believe U.S. municipalities, with rare exception, are covered under the WTO. So we're asking Canadian companies or Canadian municipalities to be covered, and I don't know if they would be covered under the WTO during these negotiations. So I'm just saying that's a track that our negotiators are taking. I still don't think it's going to solve anything at the municipal level. So I sort of like the idea of pursuing the NAFTA approach as the most logical way, but that in itself has its own implications. So that's all.
Okay, questions. We have 2 microphones in the back. Would you please identify yourself and try to make your question succinct? Mm-hmm. Up here?
Can I get to a microphone?
No, they'll bring it to you.
Well, I'm Bernard Norwood, and my affiliation, I must say, goes back a good many years. It's not current. I was involved substantially in the development of the Buy American Executive Order in 1954, and have been with it subsequently. And my attitude in working on the matter then, and in USTR in later years, was colored a little bit by my familiarity with the industrial area that Mr. Baugh talked about, having been vice president of my machinist union before going into the Army and having a career change that led me into the government eventually. The question I have is a very simple one, and it's directed to the last 3 speakers. Why aren't we talking about the Buy American Act and its formal terminology? That is, the Buy American Act of March 3rd, 1933. That seems useful, since March 3rd, 1933 is the date that the act was signed by the President. The President, we all remember, was Herbert Hoover. March 3rd, 1933, that was his last full day in office. And we know what the policies developed in this country and the world were after that. And I think it's a useful reminder that seems to have been forgotten.
I think you've just reminded us.
I would just say I did mention the Act of 1933 and how this new act diverts from that quite substantially, good and bad. But I think also we have to put in context that today's global economy is far different than what we were living under in 1933. And I think that our government has made an attempt in their interpretation of the Buy American Act to accommodate that global supply chain that we work under by allowing for substantial transformation, waivers, recognizing that we truly are dependent on our global supply chains. But again, good or bad, I will leave that to the analysts here to decide.
There's a question in the back corner there.
Thank you. Patrick Herman. I'm the Minister Counselor for Economic Affairs at the Embassy of Belgium, and working on trade for a while, I'd never heard the perspective of the European Union having wider European exceptions in the GPA. It's something I had never heard of. I've mostly heard of from American colleagues or Canadian or others that actually Europe had gone into the GPA with very limited exceptions, be them federal or sub-federal or whatever that would be called in Europe. So I would like to ask the panel if that reflects also the view of the business or of the academic community, that there would be more European protectionism, which seems to go against all what I've heard and listened to internationally so far.
I guess I would disagree with calling this protectionism. It's actually guarantees that come under the law, and various countries have cited portions of their economy under the procurement where they are going to practice this, and that's what we've seen in Europe and Canada. And I can provide you. I'll be happy to give you the list of what various countries do. I have Japan and Russia and others here of what they've done under these agreements in terms of their own sort of domestic investment pieces that they've set aside. So there's nothing illegal about this, and it's something that's straightforward. And I guess I don't view it as protectionist. One of the dangers in having a discussion about trade, and I'll be very candid about this. I met with the G20 diplomats at a meeting with the Carnegie Institute last 2 weeks ago, and I was at a meeting in Europe invited to come and speak with the international trade community and people from all over the world. And I pointed out, to folks, I said, it's interesting to me that in the context of the United States, we talk about Buy American. I had diplomatic people get up and say they admitted what we had done to be completely legal, but that's protectionist. And then they talked about the 421 tire case. And they said what you did under your adjudication system in your country is absolutely correct and legal, but that's protectionist. And I think that when you avail yourselves of the existing legislative process and laws that are put in place for agreements and use those and do that in a completely legal manner, and then you're accused of being protectionist, then in essence it's being used, the terminology is being used as pejorative to not have any conversation whatsoever about this. And I think that's one of the difficulties in even having a trade dialogue, that the second people do get up and say those kinds of things, then the immediate response is, well, that's just a protectionist reaction, even though that's why those laws were designed that way, to allow countries to engage in those actions, and that's why adjudication processes were put in place to help resolve what you could do legally and take action. And to call those things protectionist is a real problem and stifles debate and dialogue on these issues.
Ian?
Thank you. My name's Ian Brody. I was for 3 years Prime Minister Harper's Chief of Staff, but I'm here in my personal capacity, not from my current employer or from my previous employer. It strikes me from my time in government that whenever there's a crisis, and there's no question that most of the countries on the planet are in a very serious economic crisis at the moment, that there's pressure to do something in the short term to get your way out of it, and then there's also the obligation to think a little bit further down the line of how this thing plays out once the crisis is over and you're back to some sense of the new normal. And the challenge in the crisis planning is to make sure that whatever you're doing to get yourself out of the hole that you're in at the moment is not jeopardizing whatever the new normal is that you want to achieve. I guess what I'm looking at here, David, I congratulate the program on inviting 4 people who gave us very rich presentations today with a great deal of detail and seriousness about this issue. Can we step back a bit and look at what we want procurement practices to be, not just through this recovery effort in an effort to try and get some stimulus, but in the longer term? Because I think the trap we can get into here is what Chris Whatley was talking about, a compromise on Buy America. if we get into the discussion of a compromise on Buy America, we're on the losing side of this discussion, not just for the recovery efforts, but for whatever lies beyond the recovery here. What I'm looking at is there a win-win here that allows everybody to advance, not just through the very difficult stimulus piece that we're all going through, all the countries are going through. We talked about the Canadian stimulus, the American stimulus, the ones around the world. Is there a win-win here that allows us to go beyond that and to have a stronger, sustainable, better jobs, for not just in manufacturing, but in every sector in engineering and services and so forth, out the other end of this thing? There are certainly all sorts of shortcomings of WTO, NAFTA, procurement regulations. There's lots of them. When I was in government, I got more than I ever wanted to know in a briefing about this, and Buy America wasn't on the agenda when I was there. Is Buy America, for all of its shortcomings, is it a potential lever to a better world environment for government procurement at the local and state level and provincial level, municipal level, out the other end here? Or to ask it a different way, why wasn't there Buy America in this Cash for Clunkers program that you guys had here? For a very good reason, because a Buy America provision of Cash for Clunkers would have jeopardized hundreds, probably thousands of American jobs, of good manufacturing jobs, people who produce gadgets and widgets and whatever the hell they produce that gets shipped to Canada or shipped to Mexico, turned into a bigger gadget, a bigger widget, then shipped back to the United States to become a carburetor. They get shipped back to Canada to become a whatever you put a carburetor in. That gets shipped back to the United States to be produced into a car assembly that gets shipped back to Canada because that's where the final assembly comes, and they get shipped back to the United States to be sold in the final analysis. Is there some world we can get to that's not a compromise on Buy America, that's a win-win for everybody?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'll start off from the point that Bob made before. The proper term is protectionism because it implies distortions. But Bob was also right to say a lot of protectionism is legal. And unfortunately, in the political debate, it's so confused on Capitol Hill that people confuse the two. And so there is a pejorative when one says protectionism, which doesn't help the debate moving forward. The key point, in my sense, is that there is a lot of protectionism that is legal under the WTO. And for a number of reasons. One, either because there was just too much political opposition to reform through the previous 8 rounds of multilateral trade liberalization, or it was more generally part of the overall political economy bargain. You basically took several steps forward, but in order to get political support for the past liberalization, you had to agree to various provisions of domestic law that governments could use to influence allocation within their own country. And that is appropriate. I mean, we bought a lot of good from that, and so there, whether it's the 421 provision, you can call it protectionism, but it on balance, it has been very positive for China and the United States. And now, what do you want to do in terms of seeking a win-win? Well, we're not talking about $13 trillion of trade in goods and services. We're talking about a rather much smaller pool of procurement, much of it around the world, which is rather restricted, which could be opened up to access for U.S. suppliers. And in fact, we were making progress in getting China into the WTO government procurement agreement, and that progress was knocked back a couple of steps during this crisis, and hopefully we're beginning to put it back on track. But there was a delay. I think we want to be able to do that to create more opportunities for U.S. firms to source to participate in foreign tenders. Not a $1 trillion market, but substantial new opportunities. And certainly we should be able to find those opportunities in our own neighborhood. So that's where I would start.
The only thing I would add is just I do tend to be kind of focused on the immediate compromise, in part because of the timing, that we got to do something now, and also knowing who I work for in the states. The easiest way to make this happen is get the Canadian provinces in the government procurement agreement, in that states are so wrapped up just implementing the law that you need to make the fix consistent with what states have to implement anyway if you want to get it out and get it done and make it make sense for all the suppliers involved in the procuring entities. In terms of the broader kind of discussion of what is the real kind of outcome we would like for our two nations going forward, the only thing I have to add from my limited parochial state perspective is that for about 10 years now I've been focused on kind of some tension between what we create, the law created in the international domain from our own national trade policy, and the 10th Amendment. And it's not a train wreck waiting to happen. It's a manageable level of tension. But we do have states who have these clear powers and responsibilities. They don't engage in this national trade policy debate in a substantive way. And we have our own federal government who kind of likes it that way, in that they've got, USTR has their hands full just in the interagency process within the executive branch and watching their back with Congress. They don't want to do what the Canadians do and bring 9 provinces in a substantive way and have premiers hashing out as to what the national trade policy would be. I mean, to do that with 50 states would be a nightmare for USTR, and I understand where they come from. But the response has been to say, don't worry about it. They did a bunch of outreach around the Uruguay round. It was the high water mark for state-federal cooperation in trade policy, and then it stopped. And basically, the only other time they went back to the states is as we negotiated these FTAs, the bilateral FTAs that had a government procurement agreement within the Bush administration. They would go back to the states, and legally they had to say, can you sign up for this one too? And they did it with the first one, and they got about 28 state responses. And by the time we got to the last of the FTAs in the Bush administration, they only had 8 states sign up. And there's a connection between the two. If you've been saying, hey, don't worry about it, it's not going to affect you. If you have a law that isn't in compliance with one of these existing trade agreements, we're just going to defend you in the tribunal. You're not going to have to pay a judgment. Don't worry about it. States listen to that. And meanwhile, if you go back to them after the fact and say, well, but we do want you to sign, and you've got other constituencies politically in the state, from labor, from a lot of different groups who have, substantive concerns, valid concerns, who are going to the State House and expressing what those concerns may be, politically, there's no upside to you in signing on, and there's a big downside. So that's why we had 37 states sign on to the WTO government procurement agreement, but at last count, there's only 8 states who do it again.
Just a couple quick points. One, I actually think the most important thing the Canadian and U.S. government have done recently is decide they want an auto industry, and they jointly made investments to make sure that happens, and it is completely related to the bilateral trade that goes on, and your description is great because I don't think most people understand the role the Ambassador Bridge plays in all of this between Detroit and Southern Ontario and St. Catharines and all the plants that are down there. The second question, though, let me pitch it back to the Canadians in the room. Why not sign on to the procurement agreement? We wouldn't have to twist ourselves into knots to figure out a special bilateral way to get ourselves out of this mess. And that's something I don't understand. I mean, what the politics of that are.
We've got short on time, and we've got 3 questions, so I'm going to go 1, 2, 3. We'll take them all at once, and then we'll have them answered. Over here. Well, right here, Laura, and...
Hi, Matt Dessler, University of Maryland, Peterson Institute. A semantic point. People who support these measures call them Buy American, which is a popular label. People with criticism call them protectionism, which is a negative label.
I'd like to call them Invest in America.
Okay, that's a positive label. All 3 of them, or particularly the first 2, I'd argue the third a little bit, are absolutely accurate. They're clearly protectionist because they favor domestic over foreign suppliers. They're clearly Buy American. So I think I think it's silly not to claim they're not. You have to justify them. I think one comment I'd like to make, though, I thought that Dawn's point was interesting in that traditionally one of the biggest arguments against trade liberalization has been it's disruptive. nature. The fact that it, puts people out of work, that you have to retrain them, and that sort of long term. It seems to me we've come to the point with globalization where Buy American becomes disruptive, in the sense that you have people invested in global supply chain, and then we're asking them essentially to reconfigure in a way which is costly. It's costly of jobs, it's costly of contracts, and so forth. So it seems to me maybe I suspect the AFL-CIO would like us to go a good bit down this road, but it seems to me we have to recognize that in a globalized world, there are costs to going the other way, just as there are adjustment costs, or have been in the past, to moving toward trade liberalization.
I would answer that by saying, it seems to me, I watch industry throughout the world operate with transnational corporations, and adjusting supply chains has not been a problem for anybody in that manner. And I think that to suggest that this somehow is interfering with that, I think is not really accurate. I mean, you say that supply chain has done it that way, and that was trade liberalization, and to say that, well, we want to try and do it this way to stimulate the investment, recycle the dollars in the economy. I come back to that as a point of economics, of that is the fundamental goal of a stimulus package, and that's something that makes sense to do as a country, both economically and politically, that people understand that. But global supply chains do move and do change, and they don't interfere with this stuff.
Could I ask a question of the panelists?
Sure.
Would you be willing to strike the Buy American from the other legislative proposals that's flowing through right now that will have long-term implications, if the purpose of this one was truly to help stimulate our U.S. economy now?
No, I think we need to be doing this as a country. I'm back to the point that this is in a context of a greater strategy for the country of how we develop our industrial base, how we move towards these new technologies of the 21st century. We are going to think of it this way. This country is about to commit over the next decade of investing $1 to $2 trillion in the greening of our economy and in our infrastructure. And so we have choices to make about how we do that, and serious choices to make about, do we want a manufacturing base that's part of that, that's modernized, that's up to date, that is competitive internationally? Do we want to have these technologies in our economy and developing? Do we want to have that circle of innovation functioning within our economy? Well, we have choices to make, just as every other country in the world has done. Again, I encourage you to pay attention to this report from the U.S.-China Economic Security and Review Commission. Think of China as a country that 3 years ago didn't produce a wind turbine. And it set a goal to produce 10,000 megawatts worth of wind turbines by the year 2010. This year they're going to produce 13,500, and they've targeted the U.S. market. 90% of the solar products they produce are exported, targeted to the U.S. market. This is a problem not just for the United States, it is a problem for Canada. It is an issue for a lot of the rest of the advanced developed world as part of this, about what are our greater relationships going to be. And other countries do engage in a strategic planning around their manufacturing base and infrastructure and what they want to have and what they want to look like in the future. And I think this is part of that greater conversation of how you do that and how we are going to spend trillions of dollars in the coming years to lower our carbon footprint. And we better be doing it in a way that creates good jobs in this economy and opportunity for people as we do so.
Hi, excuse me. My name is Kevin Thompson. I'm from the Canadian Embassy, and I may be in a position to answer some of the questions that you posed to the Canadians in the room. But first of all, I'd like to clarify, I think, some of the mischaracterizations of some of the problems. One thing you mentioned, Bob, is that in Canada the provinces and the municipalities have an extensive list of buy local requirements. Well, as a part of this negotiation effort, we've done an extensive review of those potential restrictions, and our list is not very long at all. So I'd be I'd very much welcome if you could share with us the list of restrictions that you've referred to before. Because I think for the most part, procurement in Canada at the provincial and the municipal level has largely been open as a result of the changes to the North American economy over the last 15 years since the NAFTA was adopted, so that you have particularly at the municipal level in Canada, you've got a number of very large U.S. firms that sell into the Canadian procurement market, essentially unfettered access to that procurement market. Many of those firms are in fact organized by members of your organization. So that's I think the first point. The second is that and I think Don had mentioned this earlier, that the coverage under the GPA would not fix the problem here. And that's because very few U.S. municipalities are in fact covered by international obligation, international commitments. So a lot of the funding that has been that has flowed down to the states flows then onto the municipalities, and essentially those municipalities have been told by USTR that there are no international obligations. Even the international obligations that apply at the state level, they don't flow down to the municipalities. So signing on to the GPA is not going to solve the problem. I guess my question to you is to you, Bob, is given the fact that the Canadian government adopted a very sizable stimulus package, it imposed no local buy Canadian requirements. U.S. companies, including many companies that are organized by your members, are in fact benefiting from that stimulus package. Would the AFL-CIO be supportive of an open procurement agreement between Canada and the United States that recognizes both the integrated nature of large segments of our economy, as well as the fact that organized labor, that we share many of the same goals in terms of organized labor, and that in fact many of the unions that are members of your organization have membership on both sides of the border.
Okay, before we do, can you pass the microphone down, and we'll take this last question, and then the panel can answer.
We've talked a lot about the stimulus. I understand there were some domestic content requirements in the climate change bill that passed the House. Can you explain what those were? And Mr. Baugh, what are labor officials like you seeking as your ideal policy in the climate change legislation on this issue?
I get all the questions this time. Okay. I think there's two things. I'm not going to answer your question directly about whether we would support that. I think I went to Canada about 6 months ago for a discussion with Canadian economists about this particular issue. And one of the conclusions we came to, and we think that Canada and the U.S. both have some of the same issues that I'm trying to portray in a larger context about what does our national economy look like, what does manufacturing look like within that economy, about our countries actually having a strategy for a manufacturing base to meet those needs, and that, yes, we've taken this step here as part of that. A number of my Canadian colleagues thought, we really need to be thinking in terms like this in Canada, too, about how do we do that. And I think this actually does come back to some form of integrated discussion. Is it in the interest of Canada and the United States to have an auto industry? Absolutely, and we've taken steps to do that. Is it in the interest of Canada and the United States to have a wind turbine industry that can actually meet the needs? I mean, look, between the Great Plains and the Great Lakes and Canada, there's huge opportunity for electrical generation with this industry, but things have to be done with the power transmission system. Things have to be done to develop the industry, because currently there's only capacity to produce about 5,500 megawatts a year. Not that we can't do it, not that we don't have the skills, and God knows, not because we don't have abandoned industrial facilities and skilled people in which to do this. I mean, these are some of the big questions that, when I talk with my brothers and sisters in Canada, my colleagues up there, that we've talked about, is saying, this is the context in which we got to be having this discussion, and arguing over this particular piece of it is just pales in comparison to the kind of things that we need to be thinking about as trade unions and as countries. To the question about the current climate legislation, there's a couple things in there. Clearly, the monies that were put in the Waxman-Markey bill related to electric car investments in the batteries and stuff like that are really about spending the money in plant development and opportunity in the United States, and are directed that way. We have serious questions about all the other monies we put in the bill that don't have Buy American requirements, and we're not clear, and we're working on this, ways in which you can have the investment criteria to make sure that the same goal is accomplished that you accomplish under Buy American laws, because the applicability is different situation potentially. So we're in that kind of discussion. There's other things we put in the law that for the construction-related projects, it must have the prevailing wage. We've also tried to put in the law and had put in the bill the previous year that monies went down through the climate legislation that ended up in domestic manufacturing, that the firms that end up getting those funds should pay a prevailing wage. This is something that's new. But we said it should be at the average manufacturing wage within a state and include a full array of benefits. And the irony is you have this discussion at the federal level, and people are like, wow. And you know what? I helped run an economic development agency, and we thought about this stuff every day of the week. If you're putting in monies as a local body or a state body into a project, you ask fundamental questions. How many jobs are going to come out of that? What kind of wages will they pay so that the people can actually earn a living wage and pay taxes in your state? What kind of benefits come with them? And there are actually requirements for the projects, and they come with accountability attached to that. We do none of that at the federal level. I would raise another question. R&D. We are going to put a ton of money into research and development, both as direct grants, and the industries keep coming to us every year and wanting to change the federal tax credit system to say we want a permanent R&D tax credit. Now, you have R&D that's for basic sciences and sort of the stuff that's way out there. You have a whole bunch of R&D that's about commercialization, products. I would ask the local economic development question, what do we get for that investment? What are the employment implications of federal money, public money, and public tax dollars going into research and development? And shouldn't there be some hooks there saying that if you're going to engage in R&D for commercialization of products, then in fact we expect there to be an employment outcome related to that. And in fact, if the firms that are getting these resources don't uphold those obligations, they have to pay that money back with interest or something to that effect, which is what you do in state economic development in terms of having accountability for the monies you spend, having employment outcomes and tax revenue outcomes for these things. We need to be thinking about how we make investments as a government in this area that are part of a larger economic development. I would call it a manufacturing economic development policy.
Thank you. Any last words, Jeff?
Well, I think we have to be very careful because the last 10 minutes have have confused the issue of binational from subsidy. And what Bob was talking about for the last 5 minutes was federal subsidies for innovation, for other types of restructuring, talking about the importance of the auto industry. And yes, there were a lot of subsidies for GM and Chrysler as part of a pre-structured bankruptcy proceeding, which prevented a rather drastic free fall of a large segment of our economy. And there is a value in debating how we reallocate resources through subsidy programs to spur innovation. But that's different from Buy American procurement restrictions that mandate certain types of criteria for procuring goods and services at the federal or state level. And I think we have to be very careful about going too far down that road, or we will suffer the same type of waste that Japan has suffered, which tried the similar type of industrial management problem through innovation, which seemed like a great success in the 1980s and was a dramatic failure in the 1990s. We have the opportunity now, because of innovation in the private sector, to support that, to move into new areas that Bob was talking about, which could yield great new opportunities for production and employment. But those are subsidy programs. Those are not mandated procurement that you have to buy, that governments buy certain products. And I think you want to spur innovation in the private sector because that's where the jobs are going to be created, and not try to get all of the employment impact out of government programs that are going to, just by the nature of the political process, be messy and inefficient.
Well, thank you very much, and I hope you will all go out thinking and talking and doing about this. And I'd like to thank Ian for his suggestion of what can we do that would be win-win. So thank you very much for coming, and this will be posted soon. Have a good day.
Nice to meet you, Jeff.
You're welcome. That was great.